It gives me great pleasure then to introduce today's speaker, David Pearson, who retired in 2017 as Director of Culture, Heritage and Libraries for the City of London Corporation after a career managing libraries and collections mostly in London. David teaches regularly at the Rare Book Schools in London and Virginia and is a distinguished senior fellow of the School of Advanced Study at the University of London and the editor of the Book Collector. In 2018, he gave the Lyell Lectures in Oxford and 17th Century Private Libraries, and in 2023, the Sanders Lectures in Cambridge on Cambridge bookbinding. His monograph, English Bookbinding Styles, 1450 to 1800, is a standard reference work in its field. And it's on those issues he's going to talk to us today, so please give him a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much. You haven't heard it yet. And thank you, Richard, for those kind words. I did suggest to him a briefer form of introduction that I'm a retired librarian who looks at books, which I think is true and possibly more concise. However, thank you again. And thank you to all of you for coming, and thank you to all of you who I cannot see, but who I know are out there online who've kindly signed up for this. And so I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk about this new book on bookbindings published by the Bodleian. The book has a number of aims. It's trying to tell the story of bookbindings over the last 2 millennia or so. It tries to explain why bindings might be interesting, what they might be able to tell us about books more generally. And it showcases the outstanding collections of the Bodleian Library here, where virtually every kind of binding over those 2 millennia that I was looking to illustrate through the book, I was able to find in the Bodleian Library. So it's a great opportunity to profile the binding collections of the Bodleian Library. Books in the shape that we are familiar with, leaves folded at a spine edge and held together by some kind of sewing, what we commonly call the codex format, have been around since the time of the early Roman Empire, when that way of doing things began to take over from scrolls as the way of holding knowledge, recording it and storing it. If you had been to the Great Library of Alexandria, don't think the clicker works. If you'd been to the Great Library of Alexandria, shown here, drawn from the life in the top left-hand corner there, then you would have seen lots of people looking after lots and lots of stored scrolls. But it's around the time of the beginning of the Roman Empire that changed as the most efficient way of making books and storing knowledge, and that folding of leaves of text and sewing them and holding them together in what we think looks like a book began to emerge. And some of the earliest examples that survive to us today were found in caves in the Egyptian desert, the Nag Hammadi codices, which are what are shown on the right here. And there was an idea, because what has survived of this kind of very early codex is all found in caves in the Egyptian desert, because that's good storage conditions for this kind of thing, that the codex was particularly associated with early Christian culture in North Africa and around there, around the 2nd, 3rd centuries. But actually references to books and the form of books in the emergent Roman Empire world demonstrate that they were beginning to make books like this on both sides of the Mediterranean at that time. But very, very few early things, quite as early as this, have survived. And since then, the need for books has kept countless bookbinders in business, and the ways that they have been made and decorated have evolved from century to century. Bindings have got an obvious functional purpose. Books need to be bound to hold the text together in the right order and to keep them that way for storage and for future use. But binders have always gone way beyond the mere functional to decorate their products, to meet a desire for beauty or for luxury, because people liked it and could afford it, because they wanted to say something about themselves through the quality of their possessions, because they wanted to curry favour or influence by being able to present people with beautiful books, because they wanted to honour the value of a text by covering it with a beautiful binding appropriate to its status and its perceived value. The oldest surviving European bookbinding, the Cuthbert Gospel, which was made in the 8th century and is now in the British Library, has an elaborately decorated cover made of moulded and painted leather. And we have an image from a manuscript around the same time showing a scribe in front of a bookcase in which the books visibly have decorated covers. It's a famous manuscript, the Codex Amiatinus, and it's particularly celebrated in bookbinding history as it is the oldest depiction that we've got of decorated book covers. There's a traditional approach to historic bookbindings that's based around the idea that they're interesting if they're oh, what have I done? Sorry. Sorry about that. That they're interesting because they are beautiful. That they're more a branch of art history than book history, and that is what has generated a lot of literature on the subject of bookbindings. And it's understandable when you've got lovely bookbindings like this. But there's a lot more than that to the study of bindings, or what they can tell us. They may be decorated with the names or the initials of people to tell us who owned them in the past, or they may similarly be decorated with people's coats of arms. They may incorporate fragments of earlier books, because a lot of recycling of books went on through earlier centuries when plain paper was a relatively expensive medium and people couldn't afford to waste things, and so older books were discarded and cut up for recycling, and one of the main ways in which they were preserved as recycled objects is as bookbinders' waste, or in order to make covers for new bindings. They may help us to understand how well used or not a book has been, based on the condition of the binding and whether it's been repaired. And they may be able to tell us exactly when and where a binding was made, where it was circulating, because a lot of bindings can be dated and localized. So a trained eye will look at the one on the left here and know that was made in Oxford in the early 17th century. And they'll know that the one on the right was made in France in the middle of the 18th century. And you can tell that from the materials used, from the way the books are decorated, the nature of the tools, the layout, all of those kinds of things. So despite the fact that the spine on the book on the right tells you that the book was actually printed in 1510, it's an early 16th century imprint, the binding is very clearly much later and was made in France in the middle of the 18th century. And the quality of any individual binding tells us something about what it cost, what choices its owner was making, because binders always offered a menu of choices to their customers, from the cheap to the expensive. If you were buying a book in earlier centuries, it would be handmade, and you could have a 6-penny binding or a 10-shilling binding or a 3-guinea binding, and what you paid would determine what you got in terms of how stoutly it was made and how extensively it was decorated. So the ways that bindings were made and decorated evolved steadily over the centuries, and part of my book is a chronological narrative of that progression. It talks about the distinctive structural techniques that help to define European binding traditions from around the 8th century onwards, and it illustrates various kinds of medieval bindings, including plain and typical ones that would line the shelves of a monastic library through the medieval centuries, or treasure bindings that we would find on the altars of wealthy churches when the covers are made of precious metals, jewelled and decorated to reflect the status of the book within, and also perhaps say something about the status and the wealth and the importance of the institution that could afford to put something like this on the altar. It progresses to the many changes that we see in the first century or so after the invention of printing, when Islamic techniques for adding extra sparkle to bookbindings through gold tooling came into Europe. Gold tooling of bindings was an established tradition in the Islamic binding world through the later medieval centuries, and it came into Europe around the end of the 15th century. People debate whether it first came into Europe through Italy, through contact with the Islamic world through the Italian trading ports, or whether it came into Europe via Spain and the contact with the Moorish Islamic culture in southern Spain. The authorities have slightly differing views on this. I think there's a consensus that Italy probably has the primacy, but either way, in the 15th century, this kind of binding technique was coming into European practice. And the one on the left-hand side here is an example of one made in Italy in the late 15th century, where not only can you see the gold tooling, but I think you can see from the distinctively Islamic kind of ornament, the recognizably Islamic patterning on the cover, that Islamic influence coming into European binding. And by the end of the 16th century, upmarket workshops across Europe could make bindings like the one on the right-hand side here. I've got a chapter called Craftsmanship and Innovation, which illustrates some of the more striking binding styles that we see during succeeding centuries before the Industrial Revolution came into the world of books. Because the 19th century was a time of huge change in bookbinding. After many centuries of relative continuity as regards the way that books were made, the essential construction of a binding made across Europe, any time from about the 9th, 10th century onwards, a binding intended to last, had basically the same underlying skeleton and was put together using the same processes and using very similar equipment. And there's the earliest known depiction of bookbinding in Europe that we've got is a monk sewing a book in a 12th century manuscript, which is now in Germany, and he's using a piece of kit, a sewing frame, which is very recognizably similar to the kind of sewing frame that binders would use today. And I always think that you could swap the 12th century monk with, say, an early 18th century book sewer making a binding, and they'd know immediately what to do with each other's piece of equipment. But it did change very significantly through the 19th century, and if you look at the world of bookbinding in 1800 and how it was done, and compare it with the world a century later in 1900, you see a huge transformation. The Industrial Revolution really does come to the world of bookbinding, to the world of the book more generally as it came to the world, and you see more change during those 100 years than during many, many individual centuries before. The invention of bookbinding cloth and of machines to mass-produce binding cases saw the decline of leather-covered binding and the rise of decorated cloth, the kind of 19th century Victorian publishers' bindings with decorated cloth and bold patterns and designs on them that we are familiar with from the 19th century begin to appear in the middle of the 19th century through these changes that come in binding technique. And from then on, through the rest of the 19th century, it's a story of more and more binding like this being done and less of the traditional handcrafted kind of binding. And it also ushered in the dust jacket. And the convention which we are so familiar with today and take for granted, that the outside of a book and the imagery on the outside of a book reflects what you find inside. And it sounds so obvious to us today. You know, every book out there in the Bodleian bookshop, if you look at it, the images on its cover will tell you something about what you're going to find inside. The cover images reflect the contents. And until the 19th century and the introduction of this kind of binding, that was not the convention. It's very counterintuitive. We think, well, come on a minute, you know, it can't have been like that. But it really was. And if you look at a 17th or an 18th century binding on a theology book or a mathematics book or a geography book or whatever, more often than not, you can't tell from the decoration, however elaborately it is decorated, what the contents of the book are inside. And it is one of those changes that the 19th century ushered in, along with many others. 19th century experiments with glued bindings were not very successful. You know, I think we tend to think of bindings held together with glue, what we sometimes call perfect bindings, the modern paperback, the typical penguin book. We tend to think of those as 20th century, but experimentation with holding bindings together just with glue did begin in the 19th century, but as you can see from the example on the left there, they were not terribly successful, and they dropped the idea until it was revived in the 20th century, and we tend to think that penguin books are the archetypal type of that sort of binding and probably invented it. But they were preceded a few years earlier by a German firm called Albatross Books, who were the ones who really pioneered that kind of perfect binding, as it's called. And of course, all of us who have 1970s or 80s penguins on our shelves today know just how perfect or not that kind of binding is. You know, they snap and crack as you open them because the glue hardens and they're not perfect at all. But they are a part of the story of bookbindings, and as I say, their roots go back into the 19th century when people began to experiment with that kind of thing. But there was an arts and crafts, William Morris type inspired backlash against all this industrialization and mechanization and mass production of bookbindings. And towards the end of the 19th century, people began to rediscover or refresh or reinvigorate traditional craft binding. And Thomas Cobden Sanderson, inspired by William Morris, pioneered that movement at the end of the 19th century and produced some exquisite, beautifully designed, beautifully handcrafted bindings like the one on the left there. And that led into what we call the designer bookbinding movement of today, making books in traditional ways to be beautiful and individual. And so since that was revived at the end of the 19th century, there has been an active and flourishing tradition of continuing to make books in those kinds of ways alongside the mainstream publishing and binding industry that we are familiar with today. The book's later chapters include one that summarizes the ways in which bindings were made, what they were made of, how to recognize the kinds of features, the kinds of materials generally encountered in European bindings. There are a number of standard covering materials, usually derived from an animal skin, that you encounter time and time again in books made any time from the medieval centuries through to the early 19th century, and you can distinguish those. You can recognize calfskin from sheepskin, from goatskin, when you know what you're looking for, and recognize better quality and cheaper materials as part of that spectrum of the options that the binding trade offered. I have a chapter in the book on decorative themes, on the kinds of things which have often underpinned binding ornament: plants, animals, people, and a chapter that I call Bindings with a Purpose, with examples of bindings made to influence people in various ways: bindings for children, bindings as prizes, bindings to deceive. In the 19th century, there was quite a lucrative sideshow in making very skillful forgeries of earlier collectible bindings, and there are a number of well-known names who took 16th century books and recovered them to look as though they were expensive luxury 16th century bindings, but actually they were frauds. And if you look carefully and you know what you're looking at, you can usually distinguish these things, but some of them are very clever. And my themes chapter concludes with a very unusual example, which I call the binding as a scientific instrument. And it shows a late 17th century binding made for an eccentric French scientist. It's got a wooden front board which incorporates a long metal rod which you're meant to extract and place in a little hole on the inside of the board to use as a kind of gnomon, a kind of gnomon, to detect the wind direction. And the book was intended to be presented to Louis XIV by the author, who was quite a wealthy minor nobleman in northern France, but definitely what you'd call an eccentric scientist. And there is no evidence, sadly, that the king was moved to try the experiment, but it is a very striking and unusual example of what you can do with a bookbinding. My book is primarily European focused, but it does recognise the many different ways of making books that have evolved all over the globe. So I do have some coverage of East Asian, of Indian, of Islamic, of Byzantine binding traditions, which have all got their own important stories to tell and have all generated a huge wealth of bindings over the centuries. One of the things that I try to bring out at the beginning of the book is that bookbindings are also about people as well as books. One simple reason why I think we should respect any binding made before the middle of the 19th century, no matter how simple or elaborate or decorated or undecorated it is that it is a unique handcrafted object. Every aspect of the making of books, the making of paper, the printing of the books, the making of the type, the making of the bindings, until that time was all handcrafted, and as I say, I think they deserve respect if for that reason and no other. Most bindings through the early modern period were made professionally in small workshops that looked something like this. We've got a number of images of 16th, 17th, 18th century European bookbinderies at work, and they usually look something like this. You've got a small team of people, perhaps 4, perhaps half a dozen people, working in a room, carrying out a series of regular routine processes that are involved in taking a pile of printed sheets and turning it into a properly bound book. And it's usually a mixture of men and women. Women were always extensively involved in the craft, as well as men. There was a traditional sort of breakdown of roles. The women would often do the folding and the sewing, and the men would wield the big metal hammers to beat the spines into shape and do those kinds of things. But it was very much a craft, an industry in which both men and women were involved. Uniqueness. I was talking about uniqueness and unique handcrafted objects. Uniqueness is one of the things that Gutenberg theoretically took away from the world of books. As I'm sure you all know, Gutenberg, the father of the printing press, the man who in the middle of the 15th century invented printing using movable type, theoretically created a model for us whereby 500 copies of a book could be printed off from the same setting of type at once. And of course, every one, therefore, is not unique, they're all the same. Anybody who knows anything about early printing processes and the vagaries of the process will know that it wasn't quite like that, and that all kinds of things could happen to locked up type along the way of printing an edition. Bits of type dropped out, bits of type got damaged, letters could be substituted, and printing historians delight in looking at multiple copies of the same book and detecting these slight variants. Huge industries around things like Shakespeare's First Folio have developed around this kind of spotting slight variations. But when you compare the world of bookbinding with the world of printing, the level of uniqueness goes up 100-fold because there is just so much more variety. If you take 20 copies of the same 16th, 18th century printed book and put them on a table and look at their bindings, you will undoubtedly find a lot of variety. You'll find some that were bound around the time the book was printed. You'll find some that were bound 50 years later, 200 years later, some that have been repaired, some that haven't, some that were bound cheaply, some that were bound expensively. And each binding on all of those copies tells a story and helps to tell the individual story of that particular book. And so the binding evidence, whether it looks beautiful or whether it looks simpler, is very much part of that individual story. Being a bookbinder in the early modern world was not a glamorous or a well-paid profession. Bookbinders were always at the bottom of the economic tree in the book trade. Generally, printers were at the top and booksellers in the middle, and the bookbinders were at the bottom. And if in the 17th or 18th century you started your career binding books and learning how to bind books, and you wanted to make a successful living, one of the first things you did was get away from the binder's bench and do something more lucrative, typically sell books as well as just bind them. And we've got multiple examples of people who did that and became successful businessmen. And most of the famous names that we have in the world of bookbinding history, and there are a number of well-known ones like Samuel Merne in Restoration England, those names are typically of people who were successful businessmen. By the time they were successful, they weren't binding books anymore. They were running workshops, they were running bookselling businesses, they were diversifying their activity in many ways, and that was the way to succeed. So the people who were binding these books, although they may have been producing very beautiful things, and they were certainly producing very well-made and well-crafted things, they weren't doing it in a sort of arts and crafts kind of mindfulness kind of way. They weren't doing it in order to to express their inner beings in that sort of way. They were doing it to put bread on their tables. And it was a long, hard day that they worked from dawn till dusk, carrying out these repetitive processes. But they still left us a wonderful legacy of very impressively made things. I don't know how many people here have tried their hand at bookbinding. I've done it a couple of times, which makes me admire all the more these people from the past who did it so successfully. So I often think that these people, for all their relative humility or an anonymity in the historical record, they did manage to leave a greater legacy to people today than many ordinary people of centuries past in those books that they made and which survive to us today. The way we study historic books today focuses very much on what scholars call the material evidence of the book as a material object. We want to understand not just what books were printed, we want to know what influence they had. We want to know who read them, whether they were read, whether they had any impact with previous generations at all. And every book in that sense tells a story. It testifies to its use through its individual history, and that's manifested very much in the physical characteristics of the book, in the marks that the former owners left behind, and in the bindings. And because there was so much variety across the binding industry and on different copies of the same book, you can look at them and think about the motives behind them. You can look at every binding and say, okay, why does this binding look like this? Why did somebody spend a lot of money on this? Why did somebody spend more than they needed to have a functional book? Or the other side of the coin, what does it tell us about the history of the book? Whatever you think about the contents of the book or the strength or otherwise of my arguments about bookbinding and why it's interesting and why it's important, beyond just the immediately visual, there is no doubt at all that Bodleian Publishing have done a wonderful job on it. And it is a very lovely book with their usual design expertise. Nearly all the illustrations in the book come from books here in the Bodleian Library, and all the illustrations in my slideshow are taken from the book. So you've got some idea of the range of imagery, and I hope the quality of the imagery which you will find there. I think the book is a very fair price. Well, I mean, I wouldn't I? But seriously, it's £50 over in the shop there. You go, big, yeah, it's good value. And copies are to be had today, just across there in the Bodleian shop. And I know Claire was reminding you all of that fact as you came in, and I am duty bound to just issue that final reminder. If you would like a copy signed, I'll be out there for a little while after we've done Q&A, etc., where I will be very happy to sign it. Or you might think, I don't want my book defaced, thank you very much. Either way, I will be entirely happy. But do have a look at the book in the shop. They made a wonderful job of it. It's a really nice book. And thank you again to all of you for coming and for listening. And if you have any questions, I'll be very happy to try to answer them.